2013 is an important year for the Pacific region. We have seen many stories from the media coverage, both in New Zealand and internationally, to show that the region is changing fast. What does the future hold for New Zealand's place in the Pacific, and also for the island nations? And where is the place for indigenous reporting? With these questions in mind, I set out for a journey to explore from the eyes of some experienced journalists who know and understand the Pacific. Will Ilolahia is a Tongan broadcaster based in Auckland and currently is the interim chair of PMA, the Pacific Island Media Association. He says New Zealand media plays a vital role in informing people in the entire region.
New Zealand had a very significant overseas radio service where a lot of the news that was provided for the islands actually came from New Zealand and New Zealand overseas broadcast service. So it's a very significant influence. And even today now you have a lot of, for example, TV1 News is actually relayed to all the different islands. So the islands actually do know what's happening in New Zealand. So, significantly when I went to His Majesty's funeral, we popped into a local gathering of people, and everyone was asking for Winston Peters because they knew, and when Winston arrived, they all got around him, because they knew of the New Zealand politics. So, it's a very significant influence.
Sara Vui-talitu has been a journalist at Radio New Zealand International for about a decade. She says New Zealand plays an important role in building up the Pacific region and in helping other nations.
Well, New Zealand's got a very interesting partnership with the Pacific. Of course, there's a lot of political ties. Of course, there's a lot of ties through migration, i.e. Cook Islanders or Tokelauans who live here. So there's a lot of cooperation and exchange between New Zealand and a lot of the Pacific Island nations. Pacific nations have limited economies and land and resources, and New Zealand has the capacity to assist in a lot of those areas and to build up capacity, whereas those island nations can't do it on their own. So there is a sense of responsibility there. But I think New Zealand has a key role to play in relation to assisting Pacific nations, but not allow them to also be self-sufficient, getting their resources themselves. So it's like, what's that philosophy? Teach a man to fish, and then they can fish for a lifetime rather than giving out the fish all the time. So there needs to be a bit of a balance.
Will Ilolahia says New Zealand media also serves as a watchdog for the Pacific people to hold their governments accountable.
I'll give you another good example of just how influential New Zealand media was. When Samoa was criticised for the government spending or misspending of the tsunami and hurricane aid, a lot of Samoans got their information through a channel that I was managing, Kiwi TV, and we had on demand from Campbell Live. So basically, a lot of Samoans who didn't get their information locally, because obviously the government was trying to hide what they're doing, they actually got it through New Zealand.
The Pacific is a contested area, and New Zealand is only one and a small one of the Western powers that are present in the region. It is a huge task for the media to interpret the complexity of things that are happening in the Pacific. I asked Sara Vui-talitu for her take on the bigger picture.
Money talks in the region, so of course the US can offer a lot more financial assistance compared to New Zealand. But even so, New Zealand in its proximity and its relation to the Pacific and is in a better place to assist these island nations, whereas the US also has this huge landmass and population to cater for, as well as their own territories. So I think, and also it's difficult when you see, for instance, in Samoa, a lot of Chinese influence in relation to building up buildings and putting up resources that Samoa couldn't afford themselves. But then when it comes to maybe a international forum like voting on, say, whaling, there's an expected exchange there in relation to which side Samoa might support. If you sort of get that picture, it's like tit for tat.
So not just the traditional Western powers, the old former colonial ones, but also the emerging economic powers from Asia are influencing the Pacific Island nations, bringing wealth into the region and changing the way Pacific people see the world. Earlier this year, Tonga received a free aircraft as a gift from China. This forced a New Zealand airline, Chatham's Pacific, to quit Tonga. The competition in the Pacific is at doorstep for New Zealand, and Sara Vui-talitu thinks there are benefits for the Pacific nations, although the whole story is very complicated.
New Zealand can't compete with China. China's so influential in the Pacific now, and their influence has been growing through the years. I remember Professor Ron Crocombe, he was a Cook Islander. He did a lot of research on China's growing influence in the region, both politically, its sort of mandate to ensure that it had more support on an international level for various issues. It's a hard one because, Pacific economies need that support. They need someone to assist in so many areas, It just needs to ensure that China doesn't take over, if you like, because all of these Pacific economies have their own identity and own cultural, sort of socio-economic standpoint, and if China has so much influence that it starts to change, well, that's not a good thing.
Some Western powers have realized that if they don't invest more now, they will lose on the region. So there has been an emphasis on re-engaging with the Pacific Island nations from these old pals. Last year, a French company won the bid for a fibre optic project between Fiji and Tonga, and this year this line is up and running. As a result, Tonga is able to open its first ever call centre just recently and puts itself in a good position to compete with Fiji in call centre business. New technologies are driving the region forward and also bringing the world closer to the Pacific nations. Will Ilolahia thinks New Zealand's role in the region will become less pronounced as a result of technological advance.
Yeah, no, like for example, recently Tonga just got its new fibre optic link, and so now New Zealand actually doesn't have as much a significant influence as it had before. Technologically now, with the internet and now with the fibre optic, the islands do have increased knowledge of overseas trends. I mean, you look at Matangi Tonga, which is used to be a newspaper in Tonga, but now it's more an internet-based. They're talking about what's happening with Obama and that kind of stuff as such a major story as it was, as it is for a local story. So yeah, becoming more aware.
But still, it is the stories that affect the people's daily life ultimately catch the heart and soul of the Pacific audience. What are these stories? The recent Majuro Declaration united the Pacific in a strong call to the international community to work together to mitigate, if not to prevent, the consequences of the climate change. Environmental stories always seem to be in the heart of the Pacific. Will Ilolahia expresses his worries.
Just looking at maybe the stories of this year, I mean, there is a major worry in regard to the environment. The Pacific, for example, was the last area for us human beings to inhabit in regard to the way, when we spread around the world. But yet it seems like it's going to be the first area, because of our abuse of the environment, that it's going to disappear. So the stories that we're hearing from the Pacific now are actually of that, and a very crucial part, because, us as human beings, whether we're from any part of the world, I think there is a concern when you see your own home being washed away due to people thousands of miles away creating pollution. It's a proven fact now. The environmental change is not because of just natural development is actually it's been speeded up by us human beings abusing the environment, and that's very contrary to the Pacific Way, because the Pacific Way has always been to take care of the land, take care of the sea.
Sara Vui-talitu says environmental issues are always linked with economic stories.
Of course, when we have things like natural disasters, that aid is invaluable in order to ensure communities can get back on their feet. As you saw with the Samoan tsunami, that's taken quite a while for people to recover from, but a lot of the rebuilding has taken place now, and it just looks as if nothing has happened now.
Daniel Drekisat is the contributing editor of Pacific Media Watch at AUT University and also acting editor of Pacific Scoop. He says although the Pacific nations are very small players on the international stage, their functions are often embedded in bigger global stories, such as votes in the United Nations and the whaling issue. He says the Pacific is also a huge resource for journalists.
I think the media should care about the region, and I think there are many blind spots across the Pacific region. That is because of lack of knowledge from many journalists, that if they had known the area better, they would have covered it better, because there is so much going on in the Pacific, so much worth covering. Just from a journalistic standpoint, there is so much to cover in the Pacific going on in Fiji, in Papua New Guinea, in West Papua. We have New Caledonia, and really interesting stuff.
Will Ilolahia says journalists must always look beyond just reporting the obvious, because many Pacific stories have very complicated political contexts.
People sort of, the major powers like Japan and China, they're influencing the Pacific and that kind of stuff, because as you've pointed out, they're a key, even though they're small and small nations, small numbers, you wonder why so much money is invested. Just like the US is pouring in heaps at the moment. It's because of that vote in key areas like the UN. And for example, Japan pays a lot of support to Tuvalu and countries like that, raise the environment, because they'll know that these countries would support them in regard to the whaling issue.
So things are intertwined nationally, regionally and globally, and the media has a tremendous task ahead to represent fairly and to give balance to its reports when it comes to Pacific stories. But if we look locally at indigenous reporting from the mainstream media in New Zealand, our journalists haven't demonstrated a good understanding of the Maori issues and culture and tradition. I asked Sara Vui-talitu, what is the place for indigenous reporting? I guess it taps on the notion of what constitutes the notion of indigenous.
I think there is definitely a place for indigenous reporting, because often indigenous communities, it can be hard for a lot of reasons to hear their voice, to have that conversation. Even though those conversations may go on, the media may not necessarily pick up on those conversations. So in an indigenous setting, there's a platform or a forum to do that. And I think, for example, Maori TV, they have a great show, Native Affairs, and that show really picks up on a lot of stories I know mainstream media would never touch or pick up. And there's stories that really affect indigenous communities, like the pollution of waterways where indigenous Maori get their food, their kai from. Stories about a graveyard that's, there's a whole lot of spiritual belief and tapu around death and how to bury the dead, and a particular practitioner may not be doing it, may not see that the same way and is not paying the same respect or regard for the dead. So those sort of stories don't get told until, say, someone like Native Affairs pick them up.
Will Ilolahia's view echoes Sara's words.
In New Zealand, indigenous reporting is to give Maori a say. They have their own interpretation, that we need to get an understanding of what the people represent. So that's where I think indigenous reporting is.
Daniel Dragisette thinks bringing Pacific people into the newsroom is crucial to a greater balance in media reporting on Pacific issues.
I think indigenous reporting, again, that is lacking. There is a scarcity of ethnic diversity in media. I mean, it's mostly white, because media is supposed to represent us and be offer a plurality of opinions and kind of investigate stuff. And so you need to look at all different angles on how to view an issue.
Will Ilulakia thinks journalists in the Pacific region should have some understanding of the island way of how things are done.
The way that the Pacific should really look at our traditional way of discussing things is we have a system called whono, where we come to a consensus, whereas the Western ideal of getting power decisions is the one of the majority, you know. And by doing the whono way, in some ways we have an extra a weight of power when we stick together and work on issues that will affect us, for example, climatic change. And it's interesting that the South Pacific Forum slightly changed recently their way of making decisions. It used to be a consensus, a whono-based thing. You had to have discussion until we all came to some sort of... It was only recently when actually the whono was actually hosted here in New Zealand, a country that would be looked upon as more Western, that the voting system changed to the majority. You know, and that's where I think us Pacific people should have a look at, maybe to have a bit more, or also a bit more influence on worldly powers, is to stick together under the whono process.
Sara Vui-talitu says the media also carries the responsibility to educate people whenever there is an underrepresentation, and many Pacific stories have been eye-openers to the audience. She says the dynamics in the Pacific region is changing as new powers gaining influence and the old ones fading away. But the need to preserve the traditions is greater than ever.
The media is so powerful in that it shapes people's perceptions and point of view on whatever issue. And if there's only a certain view coming out in the media, then it sort of shapes the way most people may think. But if you get an indigenous voice in the mix, it sort of just broadens people's horizons and perspectives on, different issues, and that's a good thing.
I've come to an end of my journalistic voyage to discover this vast and resourceful blue continent, the Pacific. On my way home, walking past a bush track through the Auckland domain, I see native flora and other vegetations introduced by the Pacific people and the Europeans over the past hundreds of years. And it's this combination that reminds me of the history and the uniqueness of New Zealand and of the Pacific. I cannot say I understand this forest until I know all the trees, and this is perhaps the best analogy I can find in this little jungle after my journey. And even after I get to know all the trees, I must endeavor to take on the tremendous task of understanding the relationships. You have been listening to our Inside Story, looking inside Pacific journalism, edited and presented by Li Shi for the Pacific Media Center. Thank you for listening.